For 91.3 FM WVUD and WVUD HD1 Newark in the great state of Delaware, I'm Bill Humphrey, and thanks for listening. The following episode was recorded and produced for WVUD and our podcast listeners by me at my studio in Newton, Massachusetts. The opinions represented in this program by hosts or guests do not necessarily reflect those of WVUD, the University of Delaware, or my own political campaign committee. Episodes are available for download on Tuesdays at arsenalfordemocracy.com and from iTunes or Stitcher. We air the show in Delaware on 91.3 FM and stream it simultaneously from WVUD.org on Tuesdays at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. Follow us on Twitter at AFD Radio or like us on Facebook. This is the Arsenal for Democracy.
This land is your land. This land is my land. California, the New York Island, the redwood forest, the Gulf Stream waters. This land was made for you and me.
You're listening to Arsenal for Democracy, episode 309, recorded on May 24th, 2020. I'm your host, Bill Humphrey. Joining me, as always, on the line from Idaho is Rachel. Hello, Rachel.
Hi, Bill.
And returning to the show, former co-host, rejoining us this summer, Kelley. Welcome back to the program.
Hey, Bill. Thanks for having me.
So the previous 4 weeks, we were doing a series on the early U.S. oil industry. We had started out by talking about the current situation today in the oil industry with the prices going negative, and then we went back to the beginning with the history of the Pennsylvania oil rush, the rise of Standard Oil, the rail freight pricing wars, and so forth, and continuing on from there. But now we're going to finally talk in our final part of this mini-series about modern parallels to the rise of Gilded Age monopolism. Now, Kelley, I'll go to you first. There is obviously, this is not like we're inventing the concept of, we're in a second Gilded Age, like a lot of people have talked about this, but various people agree or disagree on the extent to which there are parallels. So I guess I'll start with you on your sort of assessments of that, having listened to our recent episodes and gone to look at some of the what other people have said on this particular topic, and then we will dive into some of the specific parallels a little bit more.
Sure. I think, like you just mentioned, a lot of us have been hearing for a while that we're in a second Gilded Age, and I sort of took that at face value, to be honest. I didn't think that much about it until listening to your recent podcast and getting a chance to dive into some of the readings. And there's a lot of similarities and parallels, which are striking and a little bit scary. Just the government's slow adoption to new technology, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few, and the raw deal that everyone else gets. And I think the thing that is most concerning to me is that the Gilded Age really ended because of regular working folks demanding more and not putting up with it anymore. And sure, things like the New Deal were sort of ushered in by bureaucrats and technocrats, but only because people were demanding them. And while it seems like there has been some movement in unions, and I think of the teachers' unions, which have been successful in the past couple of years, there still doesn't seem to be that groundswell movement. And so I hope that we're at the beginning stages of that, but it doesn't seem like we're where we need to be to demand the changes from the top.
Now, what are some of the parallels that you do see, especially after listening to the discussion that Rachel and I have been having over the past few weeks about the original Gilded Age and the Second Industrial Revolution that began around 1870?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the lack of regulation and the awareness of those in charge of how to sort of work the system and find the loopholes, thinking specifically of the rebates on the transportation of the train services. And so I think that, like, the people at the top, knowing that these loopholes were being exploited in such a way to really have an unregulated market and being so slow to change them. I think the internet has been around for a long time now. Amazon's been around for a long time, and most people in the government know exactly how Amazon is working the system, and there's just been no movement to sort of rein that in.
Now, one of the things that we talked about last week was the question of, are monopolies bad, and sort of the necessitation of the rise of monopolies as part and parcel of the Second Industrial Revolution. We were sort of starting to argue that the push to demonopolize things, break up companies, promote competition, and so forth was maybe I guess, a naive at best interpretation of both the problems and the solutions to those problems. I was wondering what you thought about the discussion that we had on that particular angle.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree that it is not as simple as just like plain old trust busting and breaking up monopolies, and that each industry is different. I think, to me, the sort of line that I draw on which when a monopoly is not favorable condition anymore is when it's just indefinite, when it's just going to be allowed to sort of perpetuate seemingly forever, because those at the top just have the power to do so and to work the system in their favor. I think there is definitely a time for sort of protection of nascent industries, but that sort of indefinite monopoly, regardless of the effect it has on workers and the people using their services, seems to be a different issue to me.
Well, and I think one of the key themes that we looked at last week was the issue of the private monopoly versus the non-private monopoly, which I think we'll be getting into a little bit later on this episode. The sense that in many cases, whether it's a natural, quote-unquote, natural monopoly, as economists call it, or whether it's a monopoly that just kind of makes more sense for the development of a particular industry, it is not necessarily true that a monopoly has to be held by someone like Rockefeller in private hands or by the financial industry and so forth. Rachel, one of the things that you and I have been talking about both on the episodes and offline as we've been preparing for these episodes are the parallels to the modern tech industry. Obviously, I think there's a lot of comparisons pretty directly in terms of the transportation sector with, companies like Uber and Lyft and that sort of thing, as well as even some of the food delivery companies that, we've been talking about lately and in previous episodes of the show. Your Uber Eats and DoorDash and those sort of things. I think there's some fairly obvious parallels to the transportation sector in the 1870s in the United States, the canals and the railroads, and mostly the railroads. But let's get back to this basics issue of how we got into this position in the first place with the tech sector. They argue both for a quasi-free market, or they'll use the language of competition and so forth, but basically saying it's not that they want a free market, they just want a private market. But it's not necessarily untrue that these things tend toward monopoly inherently as well, right?
Right. I think the way we've seen the big companies just kind of, I guess, slowly, but also not so slowly, just kind of eat up whole majorities of the market share, especially in the case of like Microsoft or Google or Amazon. It goes back several decades. One of the cases we kind of touched on, briefly mentioned last week, is Microsoft, which did actually lose an antitrust case, but they eventually settled after Microsoft filed an appeal. So Microsoft was using their power to bundle their software with their hardware. And in 2000, the court did order a breakup of Microsoft to kind of break up the hardware and the software components. So there would be two separate units to Microsoft. So Microsoft immediately appealed the decision, and then there was a settlement in 2001 after the DOJ did kind of say they weren't really interested in prosecuting the case anymore, given there was a new administration. That's not a big surprise. But on November 2nd, 2001, the Department of Justice reached an agreement with Microsoft So the settlement required Microsoft to share its application programming interfaces with third-party companies and appoint a panel of 3 people who would have full access to Microsoft systems, records, and source code for 5 years in order to ensure compliance. However, the DOJ did not require Microsoft to change any of its code, nor prevent Microsoft from tying other software with Windows in the future. I think it's a little bit different because now the products and services that are being provided are a lot less tangible than they were during the first Gilded Age. So it's kind of hard to conceptualize owning data or owning like packets of data and that infrastructure that goes with it.
Although certainly I think in the early days of the web or the transition between the research-based internet and the sort of wider world, no pun intended, wider world web, that there was a big, debate on sort of that issue of compatibility and so forth. We talked about in the, the original Gilded Age, that issue of like railroads having incompatible equipment with each other, the oil industry having various incompatibilities, and one of Rockefeller's big pushes was to standardize everything, so that there was full compatibility. That's why he called it Standard Oil. He did that under the aegis of one private company. Initially, you had, kind of the Tim Berners-Lee people and so forth, people who were active in developing sort of the open web concept at the beginning of the web era. Trying to say, here's like a universal standard we can all use. Nobody's going to really be profiting off of the standards and so forth. But then, you and I were talking last week about the issue of like, that hasn't completely meant that there is that standardization. You have companies with different dongles and, connection standards and things for their equipment. And gradually over time, it tends to shift out. But the way that it has shifted out has been largely driven by forces like the process you're talking about with Microsoft, right? That Microsoft, using kind of like Rockefeller did, where you take one little initial edge in the market and then use that to gradually sledgehammer all the competition away and consolidate. And as you get bigger and bigger in your market share, you have more and more control over the operational specifications of the market. So Microsoft Windows, a lot of people were already using that. So then they released their own internet browser, Internet Explorer. That becomes for a while the dominant browser because it's packaged together. You see similar things as well, like, that whichever computer company that makes the particular hardware decides, okay, we're going to use the USB standard or something like that, right? Then that becomes more of a standard if they already have a dominant market share. Probably one of the most clear-cut examples was the issue of high-definition DVDs, which we now call Blu-rays, but there was also various competing things. The next biggest one was called literally HD DVD, and you had several different companies on the market that were trying to pitch their device was going to be the next standard in home video playback hardware, and the ultimate thing that resolved the fight was that Sony made Blu-ray and Sony made PlayStations. So Sony made sure that all the PlayStations had a Blu-ray player built in. That meant that they automatically had an edge in the market share, and then they negotiated with one of the other large companies, I think it was probably Disney, to release their formats exclusively on Blu-ray. That ends up being the tipping point, and then everyone has to essentially adopt that as the official standard, and then Sony is now the dominant force there. But then I guess the question is, with any of these things, you start to ask, okay, well, like, to what end would it be, if we were to break up the Blu-ray market or something like that, right? What is the particular advantage that we're getting there? Like as consumers or as a society, right? Because the trust busters just sort of pitch like, oh, for the most part, there's a certain maybe minimum threshold of size for, needed to have economy of scale efficiencies and things like that at the factory level or whatever. But once you get above that, then you can start doing trust busting. And as long as you break up the companies and have competition in the free market and have appropriate regulations, then everything will be fine. Now, of course, that is directly contradicted by all of the evidence from the first round of trust busting, where the consolidations were larger by the 1930s than they had been at the beginning of the trust busting era. But let's use the example of a Blu-ray player. If you say, oh, we're going to break up Sony and have like, I guess, do it Standard Oil style by region. Okay, what's the point of that? Now you just have a regional monopoly producing Blu-ray players. To what end? Or you say, oh, this is anti-competitive. We actually need to have a competing, we need to prop up HD DVD as an alternative format so that there's competition between the two of them. Again, what is the point of that? Because now you have a bunch of stuff that's not compatible. So, again, which is not us defending like, oh, we think that Sony's great and we want them to have all the power, but you can see that there is a natural tendency in many of these arenas toward a particular kind of consolidation that brings with it various advantages. That is why, as we talked about last week, the second industrial revolution goes so hand in hand with the industrial consolidation and transportation consolidation in many cases, though to a lesser extent, is because when you get advantages of economies of scale and standardization and everything by these consolidations. But we're arguing, of course, that you don't necessarily need to have that process happening under private control. But I think that's a good sort of case study. And I think then it raises similar questions. Sure, there's now various different browser formats, and Internet Explorer, or now Microsoft Edge is not the largest one. But like, think about, a search engine like Google. Well, how many search engines do you need, right? Like, and again, not to say like, oh, we should grant, Google the crown monopoly here where they're authorized by the government to hold the monopoly on search engines or whatever. Obviously, we would be more in favor of some sort of state or worker control of a company like Google. But, why do you need multiple different types of search engines? Is the competition or quality or innovation in search technologies really only possible through market competition? Or could you have various other ways of organizing a corporation, not in private hands, that would still foster innovation internally as like a cultural thing within the company, that there are specific people that are working on, research and development of new technologies. And obviously Google turned around and did the same thing. Once they had achieved market dominance with their search engine, they started releasing things like the Chrome browser and Gmail and stuff like that, which were, basically similar to other existing technologies that were out there, but then they used those, the fact that people were already using their search engine to achieve particular kind of dominance. So Rachel, what did you think about that sort of angle on these particular cases?
Like you said, Google did kind of take their advantage to its limit. Like you said, they kind of achieved dominance in the search engine world, and then they immediately expanded on that. So the EU actually had 3 antitrust cases against Google within the last 20 years or so. So first off, starting in like 2010, the EU complained that Google shopping results were sorted first regardless of relevance, thus impacting competitors and consumers negatively. So at that point, they're kind of twisting their original purpose, because their original purpose was to show you websites based on relevance, based on how closely they fit what you're looking for, and then they're undermining that with Google Shopping. So those results get an advantage over some of the more relevant, but less well-funded or not partnered with Google directly. In 2017, Google was found guilty and was fined 2.4 billion euros, which is about 2.7 US dollars. That was the largest antitrust fine issued by the European courts. But, however, it just represented just over 2.5% of Google's 2016 revenue. So I think that really highlights the weakness of going after these corporations in the courts. You're limited to basically fining them, and it's basically a slap on the wrist. 2.5% of their revenue, that's pocket change to them. Also, the second case was related to Google AdSense. So Google required their direct partners to exclusively use Google's AdSense and could not engage with Google's competitors. Google required that partners take a minimum number of Google ads and predominantly place them above any other advertising. nor could they place ads from other services above or alongside Google's ads. And Google required partners get confirmation from Google before making any changes for how they displayed Google's competitors' ads. So to kind of draw the parallel back to like Standard Oil, that was kind of how the Rockefellers treated the railroads. They had to give Standard Oil these sweetheart deals while preventing them from doing business with like any other businesses, or else they were punished financially. So in 2019, the European Commission imposed a fine of 1.49 billion euros. Again, that's not really affecting them financially in any way. And then the most recent case is related to Android phones. So mobile manufacturers were required to pre-install Google Search and Google Chrome browser, and required them to cite Google Search as the default search service on their devices as a condition to license certain Google proprietary apps. They prevented manufacturers from selling smart mobile devices running on competing operating systems based on the Android open source code, and they gave financial incentives to manufacturers and mobile network operators on condition that they exclusively pre-install Google Search on their devices. So on July 2018, the EU fined Google 4.3 billion euros, which is about $5 billion US dollars, which is the largest fine that the EU has ever fined a company. But again, it doesn't really seem to stop Google in any way. They pay the fines, but then they kind of just continue doing what they were doing before. So there's not really any teeth behind these actions by the European Commission. So it's kind of hard to see any positive effect for the consumer or for their competitors in these actions.
Now, the other two huge tech companies that dominate the policy landscape and discussions right now that we haven't really talked about yet are obviously Amazon and Facebook. Facebook tends to be engaged in a lot of horizontal integration, buying competitors, potential competitors, various other, and Google obviously doing this too, and as does Microsoft, right? That you buy up a company that seems promising but is smaller than you so that you can use its technology. Amazon appears to be primarily engaged in vertical integration and also just conglomeration, which we did. By the time Standard Oil was broken up, Standard Oil had branched out pretty far beyond the oil industry itself to just owning kind of random things. But Amazon, obviously starting as originally an online book vendor and using that sort of early presence in the market to gain an edge that allowed it to grow significantly into, a company that, they bought the audiobook industry through Audible. They bought, the newspaper, Washington Post. They have various government contracts. They've come to dominate web services in terms of hosting for large, like cloud-based computing for a lot of other companies, even pretty significantly sized companies in the market. And then you wonder, like, at some point, are they going to just, say, well, we're going to only allow our web services to be used by our own services that compete directly with those companies. And of course, they bought Whole Foods, the grocery chain, which is probably the furthest outside of its original wheelhouse, I guess, but completely makes sense within their corporate acquisition strategy, because now they can have people, ordering food and other groceries online and using those ridiculous buttons to order stuff. But yeah, did you want to talk about Facebook and Amazon in terms of their position in the landscape?
Yeah, so Facebook recently acquired Giphy, which is a GIF search application, basically. So a lot of websites and other apps use Giphy to kind of have this database of GIFs for like reactions or like creating these posts online. I think Twitter uses it, Snapchat, Slack, just a whole bunch of websites use this, I guess, GIF database. And now Facebook acquired them. And I guess the big concern is that they're just going to have access to a lot more data, which they already did through things like Snapchat and Instagram before, which did use Giphy. But now, as a Fast Company article says, the Giphy data might also reveal the growing popularity of a new app or service. If such an app were to suddenly start making a lot of API calls to Giphy, it might reveal that the app's user base was growing quickly. And anything that's attracting attention on the internet is something Facebook wants to know about. Virality is its business, and oftentimes virality is what, I guess, determines its next purchase. I think like WhatsApp became a really popular text messaging service, so then Facebook acquired them. Instagram was a really popular photo sharing service, so Facebook acquired them. So the next big thing would just be kind of put on the shopping list for Facebook, so they can just continue to grow and control more of social media or data sharing. So Congress has kind of noticed Facebook's passion for acquisitions. And actually, Elizabeth Warren put out a statement where she's pushing for the passage of a bill that will kind of halt large mergers during the coronavirus epidemic and crisis. So in light of Facebook's Giphy purchase, quote, Facebook's acquisition is yet another example of a giant company using the pandemic to further consolidate power. This time it's a company with a history of privacy violations gaining more control over online communications. I think we've kind of highlighted Warren as someone who's more on the bust side of things. I think she's kind of put it
she's
forth.
sort of leading the break 'em up charge, like again, as if that will actually solve all of the problems in the situation.
Yeah, I think she's kind of treating it like a magic bullet that will, magically solve all the inequities in the market. But as we've seen, that it's not quite the panacea that she wants to put it forth as. The other big player is Amazon. So like you said, kind of their secret power is the fact that they own almost half of the cloud computing market. So customers rent services from companies such as Amazon and Microsoft rather than purchasing the hardware and software to operate in their own data centers. The design of the technology allows customers to tap into massive farms of servers as they need to. And because the tech giants manage the technology, it runs the latest version of software and is thought to have the highest level of security. However, I feel like this is potentially very dangerous because a lot of our government websites are run on Amazon Web Services. And like you said, they have the power to decide how their websites act. So I think it's very dangerous that the fact that we're merely renting our data services from a company rather than having that ownership over it. So you never.
I think it's baffling, for one thing, why, if the government knows that it needs that much cloud stuff, how much variance can there actually be? Like, a lot of the data is probably long-term data that's going to need to be stored semi-permanently. Why is the government not building its own capacity?
Right. And I mean, the internet itself was a government-funded project. I don't understand why they let go of that power so quickly over the past 10 or so years. And we're renting our data. I think it's something that people have kind of rung the alarm about on personal data. So like you said, they own Kindle, so they're renting books to you, or Amazon Music, they're renting music to you. You don't actually have ownership of that data, which is very concerning.
Kelley, your thoughts on these various tech companies?
Yeah, well, I was going to add on the web services front and how it being owned by government, that is not only a problem for the federal government, but also for local governments and state governments. And those might be entities that just don't have the capacity to build out their own data storage, and so need some sort of coordinated strategy. But that problem is obvious in things like the Department of Defense, but also very present in local governments that don't have the capacity to fix it on their own.
So I think that this brings us finally to our question that we were sort of getting at last week, and we've gotten at on previous episodes. Last May, we had talked about this issue of Facebook and Amazon's consolidations and acquisitions, and the idea of, like, do you break up these companies or do you see some utility? Like, the part of the reason that Amazon becomes so popular isn't just because, oh, it's the market leader and has the brand name. That's certainly important, but also because there is some convenience aspect that people are finding in it that, that is partly related to the vertical integration, right? If you go one-stop shopping where it's one company, I think that, Walmart in many ways could have become one of these giant companies had it made the jump faster to web shopping than it did. They obviously have a large physical presence all over the country as well. And certainly Amazon, behind the scenes has a large physical presence in the way that Walmart does, in the sense of having all these warehouses all over the country. But the one-stop shopping is convenient to people. So then the question is, like, if you break up, say, Amazon and Audible and Kindle and the web services and the newspaper and the Whole Foods and all of these different things, maybe you're solving some problems, but of course the consumers will be upset about it because it's less convenient for them or whatever. And I guess you could say, well, tough luck. But I think that probably there are some advantages to some of these integrations, even as there are concerns with a lot of it, rightly so. And so the question is, what are the alternative models? And as we talked about last year, there are basically two different models that have been advanced at various points in American history to dealing with this, that are not the trust-busting approach and are not just let them run wild in the private market. The first is state ownership of monopolies. The second is worker ownership of monopolies. And then you could hybridize the two of those in some way as well. So I wanted to get into that. As I kind of alluded to last week with the railroads and so forth, and, talking about examples like the Blu-ray player issue and stuff like that, there is the idea that, like, oh, competition automatically is good or necessary is not necessarily logical. It's most obvious in the arena of utilities, which is why economists refer to that as quote unquote natural monopolies, right? It's a huge investment of infrastructure and so forth to build, whether it's a rail line or a road or a cable for your various communications, telecommunications, internet, phone, all kinds of things. Yeah, it's a big investment, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to have multiple companies. But the idea that, we'll just have a natural monopoly that's in private hands, but it's like authorized by the government, that doesn't really work for me either. But the idea of, like, if we just had like two different cable companies next to each other or two different railroads next to each other, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense as well. And that's where you get into these alternative models from the left. State ownership probably being the one with the broader consensus, I would say, across the world, compared to direct worker ownership. But that was, for a long time in the United States, the preferred model. Before the Russian Revolution, before the dominance of social democracy in Europe, the proposal was, again, the syndicalist model, where you have the workers take direct control and ownership of their own companies. You consolidate entire industries into one company. So they say this is the natural tendency of capital, which, again, capital can be in private hands or public hands or worker hands or whatever, but it doesn't necessarily have to be in private hands. You say the tendency of capital in the second industrial revolution, in this first Gilded Age, is to consolidate these into like one giant company that dominates a particular industry. The example often being used because of where Eugene Debs was typically doing most of his work would be the railroads, for example, right? So you have one giant rail company, and it would be owned by the workers in their various unions. You would try to consolidate them into one union as well as part of that process to take direct control by the workers. And the syndicalist theory, again, this is the pre-Russian Revolution era when communism takes more of a dominant strain in leftism around the world, with the alternative of Eurocommunism and social democracy as another branch of things as well. The idea there was and this was the popular version in the United States, was that Standard Oil, you would have one giant oil company, you would have one giant steel company, one giant rail company, et cetera, and they would be owned and controlled by the workers. That basically fell out of favor as communism and the Social Democrats in Europe came to power in their various countries and were offering a model of state ownership. And there's also, as Kelley's going to talk about, there are some precedents within the system that we have, and of course historically, even going back to the colonial periods, where you would have state-granted monopolies, often directly owned and controlled by the government. So that is another reason that sort of probably became more of the preferred model. Did you want to talk a little bit about that, Kelley, and some of the modern-day pushes to potentially revive that?
Sure. So I think that when I think about monopolies and ending them either by trust busting or just changing ownership, it comes down to a piece around accountability. And I think part of the problems with the monopolies we've discussed today is that not only is it monopoly of a company, but it's a single man. It's Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg or Bill Gates. And so the idea of a state-run monopoly is that the state is accountable to the people. It introduces measures of transparency. It forces the operators to run it in a way that is beneficial to the people. And of course, there are serious skeptics and downsides to this model as well. It's not that everything should be a state-run model, but two things I looked at in particular were liquor stores and the current conversation around PG&E in Northern California. I think liquor stores sort of caught my attention. And as I looked more into it, it seems that the states that have that are state-run liquor stores, it is a direct descendant of Prohibition. So when Prohibition ended, all it really did was default decisions about alcohol back to the states. And some states decided that they would run those stores themselves. Other states decided they would have some sort of regulatory authority, and some states became more of a free-for-all. After growing up in Massachusetts and spending so much of my life on the East Coast, I was a little startled to see like tequila in gas stations in Michigan, but just goes to show the wide variety of alcohol laws. Washington State in 2012 voted to privatize their formerly public liquor stores. And many voters say that they regret that decision in large part because of just the huge new number of liquor stores that popped up. I mean, how many liquor stores do you really need in a safe and healthy community? So they were just disturbed by the number of liquor stores that popped up. The price of liquor also rose in large part because in order to make up for some of the revenue that the state would no longer be getting from the stores, they had to implement a bunch of taxes on liquor. I was surprised to see that New Hampshire, 6.5% of their state revenue actually comes from these public liquor stores. So it can be a way to both generate revenue for the state for things like infrastructure and education, as well as offer some sort of control and accountability. I think the other most obvious example that pops to mind in this day and age is the decision that California has to make about whether or not to take over the PG&E utility company, which has declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy partially as a result of lawsuits over wildfires, really, really devastating wildfires that their equipment started. I think the conversation around the utilities in California has been partially just so charged because on both sides, public utilities run well and successfully. There are examples, and public utilities that are facing the same problem as PG&E. So California looked to adopt a model similar to Long Island, but Long Island's utility organization is currently facing mountains of debt. But in the Trinity County in California, there are examples of public-run utilities that have been fairly successful. So I think it's just a matter of accountability and governance, like anything else. It's not a sure shot, but it'll be interesting to see what Governor Newsom decides to do there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the thing that a lot of people have in their mind when they are thinking about these state monopoly corporations is, the Soviet model, or at least their perception of the Soviet model, because obviously the perception matters more than the reality in many cases with these things. But their perception is that this is going to be, that state monopolies of these industries would be, discouraging long-term infrastructural investments with, state capital, right? They say, oh, you have to cut your costs. We can't afford to give you money for maintenance and things like that, which would be the same problem as PG&E in private hands, right? All the wildfires and stuff that they've started, that's directly related to disinvestment. Similarly, there's a majority of the dams in this country are in private hands, and a lot of those owners, like the one that just ruptured in Michigan, the owners are like, I don't feel like making the capital upgrade investments. So it is a question, as you said, of accountability and governance. It's not like just turning it over to the public automatically makes things good. But by the same token, and the flip side is, you don't have to have a structural underinvestment in your state monopoly companies. That's not something that you necessarily have to do. That's a political choice as well.
Yeah.
But I think that speaks to a larger thing, which is this mythology of like, oh, the private companies, they're so much more nimble decision makers, and they don't have this huge bureaucracy like the Soviet Union's companies doing state capitalism, or these bloated and bureaucratic European social democratic companies, which again, we're talking about perception more than the issue of reality here. But a lot of these giant corporations are huge bureaucratic corporations. I mean, that was one of the other things which we didn't really get into very much in the previous episodes. In the early U.S. oil industry, the rise of the Gilded Age, the Second Industrial Revolution, the other thing besides consolidation and this, we have efficiencies of scale, economies of scale, things like that, is the rise of the private bureaucracy within these corporations, right? There, you can say, oh, there's one guy at the top of Facebook and one guy at the top of Amazon making the decisions, but there is still a huge corporate bureaucracy within those companies that is executing those decisions and implementing them and so forth. And you can have some of the same challenges that a state enterprise faces within the private sector. So the idea that, and this is the same thing, when we talk about private insurance, it's like, obviously nationalizing health insurance does not lead to the creation of a larger bureaucracy in health insurance, and probably actually makes a smaller bureaucracy in health insurance, because right now you have the double bureaucracy of a bureaucracy in every single one of the health insurance companies themselves to figure out whether or not a claim gets paid or not, or what amount of it gets paid, and the negotiation process with the hospitals. And you have to have on the hospital side, or even a small healthcare provider, having a bureaucracy just to figure out how to deal with all of these different health insurance companies. So the idea of like, nationalizing it into a state-owned enterprise would automatically mean bureaucracy, that's absurd as well. All of these things boil down to questions of governance and accountability. And of course, you can set targets and objectives with your state-owned enterprises. That's the other thing too. The idea of like, we'll get so much less innovation if it's state-owned enterprises. I think that's not really true. For one thing, you could have a central objective of your corporate governance in your state-owned enterprise be promoting and funding significant research and development divisions that come up with new technologies, new ways of saving money, new ways of delivering services to the consumers. The other thing would be to go into a more hybrid approach, a mixed market model, even where you say that the startup companies are still private. Maybe you have some pools of government investment dollars or something, or maybe you just have private investors provide the seed money for those things. But you say the startup is private, they can come up with a new innovation, and once it gets to a certain scale or size, then they automatically sell to the government. Because currently, the way that it generally works is that, yeah, occasionally one startup will break through from an initial small size and become one of these giant tech companies, but that's very rare and very unlikely these days. Typically what happens is that somebody starts a new technology, it takes off, as Rachel said, something like Snapchat or whatever suddenly becomes popular, and then it's immediately bought by one of these much larger companies, and they bring it into their portfolio. You could have a similar thing as well, where once you reach a certain scale, the government acquires it and, pays out to the investors that put up the seed money or whatever, and maybe they still make a tidy sum. That's one way of doing it. Other ways, you can just have significant research and development budgets. I think, as Rachel alluded to, the development of the internet at the beginning was itself heavily government funded, and often done through government agencies and research universities backed by the federal government and so forth. And then the other way of doing this that's not the state model is, of course, that syndicalist worker model, or to take elements and bits and pieces from that. I have some doubts myself as to whether or not having major industrial corporations entirely owned by workers and not the state provides that accountability and democratic governance that Kelley was talking about. I can see some cases where there would be more democracy through complete ownership by the workers, and I can see some cases where that could go in potentially bad directions. For example, we've obviously talked on this show previously about the problems of various unions representing oil workers, especially pipeline workers, protesting against any efforts to rein in construction of pipelines, to rein in production of oil, to wind down the oil industry as a whole. That can be a challenge. I think you could also have a situation where, if you have a worker-controlled defense company that manufactures missiles, they're not going to have a strong incentive to be against going to war and using those missiles. But we have seen that workers who have more control over, say, the docks where they're loading and unloading missiles that are bound for places like Yemen or Vietnam, they have flexed that power and stopped those shipments. So the idea that there's some sort of unified interest among workers is not necessarily true either. They may have broadly aligned interests, but in some cases, their interests can be in conflict with the rest of what is good for society. And it's not necessarily clear that, like, a state-owned enterprise, a defense contractor, has any different approach than a worker-owned defense contractor. Because I don't think that a worker-owned missile manufacturing company is necessarily going to be like the union setting its own foreign policy and deciding what's a just war versus an unjust war. And so they would have probably similar interests to the rest of the state, at which point you haven't really achieved anything. Obviously, I think there is some merit to having a significant level of worker governance within a corporation, especially a monopoly corporation, in that they get to set a lot of the worker protections and labor conditions. And I think that potentially becomes hugely important for addressing one of the major sources of the latest round of tech industry consolidations and monopolizations, which is that concept of regulatory arbitrage, right? A company like Uber, which these companies tend to be owned by, or either owned outright by, a larger parent company, or have significant investment from other major companies or banks. And then they in turn own, companies further down the chain like Uber Eats or various other spin-offs and things like that. And that's just to name one example. The model that is there, the innovation is quote unquote, oh, we did an app, but the actual innovation we all understand if we look at it for even 2 seconds is that they are treating all of their workers, or almost all of their workers, as contractors, and continually are cutting the pay rates for them, the per ride compensation, things like that. And I think that, if you have some level of worker control over these corporations, even if they are ultimately state owned, you might have more ability to rein in certain things like that. But I mean, that's the other thing, is just like, The idea that, oh, if we just break up these companies, then, we'll have all this competition. It's like, but that was the premise of a company like Uber or Lyft was, oh, we're out competing with the traditional taxi model. But again, they're not really out competing. They have an app that makes it easier to order a ride. And then the actual way that they gain market dominance is by having cheaper rides that are either cheaper because they are paying the workers less and exploiting them as contractors, or, which is the regulatory arbitrage, or they are doing kind of the Standard Oil approach, which is where you have the money people behind the scenes allowing them, and this is also something that we saw the railroads do in our discussion of the railroad rate wars. If you have the money people authorizing you to lose money for a certain period of time as a means of gaining a market edge where you're underbidding all of your competition, obviously you're going to generate market share. Rachel, I'll go back to you for your closing thoughts on all of this.
Yeah, like you said, I think there are definite disadvantages to having a purely worker-owned monopoly. Your examples being right on the money, the missile, the worker-owned missile company, which I think it'd be a pretty far off dream to even get to that level of worker ownership. But at that point, I think then we can definitely swoop in and have the state take over. I just think that we're definitely going to have to discuss this more in the coming years, especially with our crumbling infrastructure. And I know that we're going to have to take a look at privately owned power companies and dams and whatnot, especially as the Michigan example elucidates pretty starkly. We're going to have to face that sooner rather than later in these coming years. And I would like a strong movement to bring those under the umbrella of a more either whether it is worker owned or state owned under a more publicly owned umbrella and model for the future.
Kelley, I'll go to you now.
I think one thing that the current pandemic has brought into view really clearly, if it wasn't clear already, was just how necessary internet services really are. Now, if a household doesn't have internet, kids aren't attending school. There's no opportunity for work, that sort of thing. So I think that it is time to sort of accept that the internet is part of our lives, definitely not going anywhere. It is integral to really being a citizen in our world at this point. And I think that we need to consider regulating it or adopting measures that really treat it as something that the public truly needs.
I think, though, the challenge, as we've seen in places like Western Massachusetts, and I'm sure in places like Idaho, and certainly like I know rural Washington, it's been an issue. The idea of just regulating one of these monopolies is, when it's in private hands, is not enough, right?
Absolutely.
It's not providing the level of service we need. They make various promises about what they're going to do with their monopoly control, and they never follow through on it. They never build the infrastructure. But it's also not something that's just solved by having a second company come in and compete in the same service area. And in fact, that's arguably economically redundant and a waste of resources.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's time to think about it as a public good, and there are different ways to sort of monitor and regulate and govern public goods in different settings, but it is true that it is not going to be profitable to serve certain sections of America with the internet. And so that is a good case for having profits sort of not make these decisions.
All right. Well, Kelley, it's so great to have you back on Arsenal for Democracy. We're looking forward to talking to you more over the course of this summer.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Rachel, thank you as well.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Kelley.